Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth is finally here, and we all know what that means. It's time for a saga. Tom Bombadil has taken the Commander world by storm. He protects himself as long as you're telling enough stories, and once each turn when you complete a saga, he'll dig to find you a brand new one. 5-color sagas all the way! Tom Bombadil already commands more than 2,000 decks on EDHREC. The set may be new, but let's be honest, players have been eager for a 5-color saga deck for years now, with lots of folks using commanders like Garth One-Eye or Go Shintai as the deck leader in the meantime. These lists have been practically waiting in the wings for the right commander to arrive, and it's finally here to deliver. Let's get to it. We'll take Tom Bomb's average deck list from the EDHREC average deck feature and import it to the Architect deck building website. As always in this series, any swaps we make must either keep the list cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. We are gaga for sagas. The starting list contains 25 of them, plus a smattering of enchantment helping assistance to help make sure that this deck's engine runs smoothly. 5-color decks have so many possible directions to go, so it's nice to have a hyper-specific set of abilities that encourage our build path here. I'll note right off the bat that while researching different sagas to potentially use or swap out in this deck, I actually found myself very impressed by the ones the average player base has already converged upon. It didn't feel like there were any big missing standouts, for instance. Although there are a few here that I'll critique in a little bit. We certainly need a high density of these sagas, though our commander's digging ability makes it remarkably easy to find more of them, which is a huge plus. And oh, by the way, more than half of this deck's price is contained just in the land base alone. Rest assured that yes, we will indeed have a budget version of this deck list at the end of this video, as well as some other honorable mentions later on. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. We first have to get to know how this deck works and what its MVP cards are. Obviously, the stars of the show are the sagas themselves. Major standouts like Kiora Best's the Sea God, the Kami War, and frankly a lot of other Universes Beyond cards make an all-star showing in this list, just overwhelming the table. Be careful, this deck has a lot of triggers to keep track of. To cut right to the heart of it, I think the most crucial aspect to point out here is that a lot of the saga abilities can have the effect of being a tad bit control-y. You may have noticed that there aren't a ton of classic removal spells in the deck, for instance, and that's largely because so many of the sagas themselves can either outright destroy things or tap them down and stun them, bounce them, wipe away tons of tiny creatures and tokens and stuff like that. The abilities on any individual saga may seem small, but when 2 or 3 of them are ticking away each turn, things really get out of hand. We even have a few cards here that can copy our triggered abilities too, which is especially spicy. And of course, there are tons of cards in the deck to help manipulate our storytelling even further. Adding and removing extra lore counters can help us reset a saga, for instance, to re-trigger the most important abilities on the card. A lot of sagas have abilities that last for as long as we control the saga itself, so removing those counters can help us keep those effects around indefinitely. But remember, chapter abilities only trigger when a lore counter is added, not when a lore counter is removed, so that's an important thing to note about our counter manipulations. A handful of cards add extra lore counters too, to help us get saga effects on our opponent's turns, which is especially helpful to trigger Tom Bombadil multiple times per round, not just once on each of our own turns. Adding extra counters could even help him get his protective abilities at instant speed, too. And when all else fails, we've got cards that can help us get a ton of enchantments back from the graveyard, perhaps even triggering a bunch of constellation effects to make our position even more insurmountable. All that said, there are a few things about this list that need some attention. Honestly, the first thing I want to start with is that this deck needs more dedicated win conditions, so I'm going to add in these 2 enchantment token makers stat. This deck accumulates a lot of value, but if you're not careful, it can feel like all you're doing is just spinning your wheels. And when so many of the sagas in this deck feel a little bit like control-y type cards, your opponents will really appreciate it if you kill them faster, please. Kiora Best's the Sea God can't be the only win con in the deck, you know? So the Archon and the Haunting are a big help to actually give us proper forward momentum. Of course, to add, we must cut, and I'm worried that people will think I don't like this character or something, but I'm cutting Calyx in this deck. If this deck were only 2 colors or like 3, I'd probably keep them. But in this deck, the Planeswalker felt perfunctory. That removal ability is versatile and yet so limited, and the digging ability is nothing compared to our commander. For now, I think these awesome Calyx cards just belong in a different type of enchantment deck. Alright, there's one more huge Oliphant in the room that we need to talk about too, and that's this freaking land count. 34 lands is just low. There are elf decks out there playing 33 lands, and at least those decks are running like a minimum of 18 mana dorks, you know? We do not have that type of mana consistency here. I feel like this always happens. Players' eyes are way bigger than their stomachs, so we go overboard on the cool cards and forget to eat our veggies. We need to be able to hit our land drops, so I'm gonna get 2 more lands in here, because if we want to cast our 5 mana, 5 color commander, we need actual resources to do it. In particular, I'd like to shout out Path of Ancestry, because even if it enters tapped, it's a 5 color land, and we love that color fixing. Honestly, as long as we're talking about mana things, I might as well talk about 2 of the other creatures I didn't really care for, and that's these 2 enchantment cost reducers. I have a tricky relationship with cost reducer cards. I like them in theory, but in my opinion, if you're going to reduce costs on something, you need to do a little bit of math. And you have to weigh that math against the fact that these cards are not themselves enchantments. This deck isn't explicitly an enchantress deck in the vein of, like, Sithis Harvest's Hand, where you're chaining 8 billion enchantments all on one turn, where that cost reduction really adds up. But this deck does contain a Sithis, you know? In a world where we're already running Jukai Naturalist, I feel like the Herald and the Starfield Mystic leave a little bit to be desired. Non-enchantment cards take up a premium card slot, so we have to be a little more critical of them. And that's why I don't think these 2 make the cut. In fact, not only that, but I'm even going to go the extra mile and swap out the Cultivate for a simple Fertile Ground. This deck doesn't contain a Kodama's Reach, it just has the Cultivate. And if that effect was really important, you would expect both to be there. Cultivate is, of course, one of the most iconic cards in the entire Commander format. But in an enchantment deck, I like Enchantment Ramp. It triggers more of our Constellation effects, and it makes even a simple ramp card a lot more impactful even when we draw it late game. Okay, I've got some other stuff to add, but first we have to make some room, and I want to go over some of the sagas we're using. The vast majority of these are brilliant, top of their class, grade A sagas, and it'd be hard to do better than them. In fact, some of them flip into true powerhouses on the back half, which can really help us when we need to start pushing to end the game. But some of them are also lackluster? Furia's Retribution in particular just nagged at me. One angel, some kind of removal, and a very specific final chapter. I was just never super pleased to see this one. And I think the same goes for Azusa's Many Journeys and the Restoration of Iganjo. In a budget deck, I'd be all on board, but man, these did not feel good to flip into, nor did they feel good to flip over. Even resetting their counters didn't feel very high value. Compared to some of the other flip sagas that we're packing, these stood out as frustrating. And I even found myself occasionally wishing that they would actually just go to the graveyard so that we could resurrect them with other cool enchantment recursion effects in the deck. But yeah, we don't have a lot of basic planes to fetch. Gaining 3 life on that chapter is just not great, and even if we do some crafty lore counter shenanigans that makes Tom flip into a saga during an opponent's turn, hitting an Azusa's Many Journeys felt especially meager. We need a decent number of sagas in the deck, it's true, but there are already a lot here, and I think we can make room for better enablers than these. Speaking of which, let's add one more enchantment in. You might expect me to add in a saga, and I am, but only kind of. I want to get Estrad's Invocation into this deck because it is high-key one of the best things I've ever seen this deck do. Copy a saga, and then every turn you have the option to reset it. Are you kidding me? This card is gas in this deck. It's bonkers. It's incredible. And it's also like $8. So this is admittedly one of the higher budget additions that I've ever made in this series. But I really just can't overstate the importance of this card for the deck. It kicks everything into overdrive. Now, if I'm over here having the audacity to add a more expensive card into the deck, I'm obviously cutting something, right? Yes, indeed. I think Estrid's Invocation would be a better use of Tom Bomb's financial investments than this here Heroic Intervention. Heroic Intervention is, again, one of the most iconic cards in the format. But if we're doing things right, I think Tom himself should already be mostly protected with his own ability. This card's mostly here, I think, to protect against the mass board wipes, especially those that destroy all enchantments, but I think we have some solutions to that particular problem already, so I'm not quite as stressed about that possibility. At least, I'm not $12 Heroic Intervention stressed about it. I think having cards like Estrid's Invocation, or some of those win conditions we added earlier, will help us jump a bigger hurdle than this one card's protection will. Especially because I think we can replace the intervention with even trickier effects that cost way less money. I truly recommend the cards Flicker of Fate and Scroll Shift for this deck. Insta-flicker a creature is a classic way to save it from removal, and the same goes for saving enchantments. But here, it's not just saving an enchantment. It's resetting a Saga, and resetting it right away. None of that come back at the beginning of the next end step nonsense. No, this is immediate, and that's very important for a deck that has this many constellation triggers and this many cards that are usually only expected to be played at sorcery speed. Like, oh, you declared an attack on me? Instant speed flicker my removal Saga to take out your attacker. Bet you didn't see that one coming. That's already delicious, but that's not even the best part, because Sagas don't immediately vanish as soon as they hit their last chapter. They'll get their lore counter, and then their final ability will be put onto the stack. And that's what makes cards like Gen so tricky in this deck list. In response to that final chapter ability on the stack, you can use cards like Gen to swap around the enchantment. And for our purposes here, we can pull the same move, flickering the Saga in response to that last trigger to reset the enchantment while still getting that final chapter ability. These blink spells can function as budget protection and as budget resets for our very best enchantments at instant speed to make sure that even when our opponents think we have no counter removers around and that our very biggest stories are about to end, we can still start them all over again. Those are my official swaps, but I have a few honorable mentions to shout out before we get to the budget version of the deck list. If you're trying to put the bomb in Bombadil, well, there's no shortage of amazing enchantments and enchantment helpers that you can put into the list. Of course, some of these cards are wildly expensive, and you don't need them. And in some cases, cards that have an immense popularity in the format at large will make some people feel like those cards might ruin the strict theming of a deck, and I understand that well enough. But, you know, they are enchantments, and enchantments trigger stuff like constellation effects, so it's not like you'd be, quote, wrong for playing any of them, you know? Though some players may choose to take this deck in a slightly blinkier direction to reset things a little bit more often. Season to your taste. To be honest, the things that are of greatest interest to me are the mana helpers and color fixers. I'd err on the side of those upgrades first if possible. No matter what your upgrades are, just make sure not to cut too many more of the Sagas themselves to make room for these cards, because we need those Sagas for the deck to work at all. It's true, I cut a few, but I wouldn't say to go below 20 of them. To be honest, I suspect that regular creatures like Gen or Glissa, or a few of the lesser impact counter manipulators, may be the things that people swap out to make room for more expensive cards, to make things a little less fiddly and a lot more straightforward. Also, real quick, since I'm sure folks are wondering about it, the card All Will Be One is another enchantment and win condition that interacts with counters on our permanents, so I think it will be expected that that card gets a call out here. I'll admit, though, that I'm actually on the fence about it in this deck. The number of lore counters we get stays pretty small, and barring combo stuff, I felt like it only did meaningful damage when things were already going really well for the deck, such as when we're recurring a bunch of enchantments all at the same time. But if this card has worked out well for you, I'd love to hear more about your experiences with it. Okay, that's the first deck list, linked in the description as always, but now we must move on to Chapter 2 and discuss how to make this deck more budget-friendly. It turns out we're cutting more than $350 from the price of this deck when making the budget version. And that sounds like a lot of work, right? But just honestly, it wasn't. It doesn't take that much. Sometimes a lot of the price of a deck is contained in just a few cards that are not the actual meat of the strategy, they're just sort of ancillary to it, so the deck still gets to do exactly what it wants to. I mentioned it before, but half the cost of this deck is located just in the lands. These are all very good cards, but we'll be fine without them. In their place, we'll have a handful of the traditional tri-lands, a couple of well-placed mana fixers, budget fetches, hopefully nothing that makes us feel too slow, and we'll try our best to keep a smattering of dual-typed lands in the deck as well, because we still have a number of cards that explicitly fetch out specific land types from our deck, and we want to make sure that those cards can still fix our colors for us. A lot more of these cards may enter tapped, but that tempo hit is nothing compared to the $200+ we'll save. Easy peasy. After that, let's tackle the non-land cards. Sheoldred and Jin may flip into Sagas, but we'll be okay without them. Tutor, Fable, Starfield, we shall bid you all adieu. Weirdly, this does also mean that we lose the Invocation card that I added earlier, but hey, that's fine. And with that, we're all good. We only had to cut like 8 cards. And doing a quick scroll through again, look how much action we still have. Swapping the land base and cutting just a handful of cards is going to save us hundreds of dollars, and the actual meat of the strategy is basically just completely untouched. We're still just a good-natured god bard ready to share so many stories with our opponents that they'll simply crumble under the weight of our verbosity. So to that end, let's fill in a few more cards. I'm going to start with 2 cards that I tried desperately to fit into the main list. The Enchantresses. We already had a few in the first list, but we mostly favored Constellation over cast triggers. And frankly, Tom's trigger is a lot of advantage all on its own. Again, this deck isn't like the usual enchantment decks that spin off uncontrollably by casting 10 things a turn and drawing 48 cards, but yeah, these are very good helpers to have. We just need some good old-fashioned card draw. We lost a 2-mana ramp spell too, so I'll add another 2-mana enchantment ramp source, Trace of Abundance. I almost put this one into the main list as well, but it's technically tricky to cast sometimes. It's just great though. Ramp with extra enchantment benefits? That's perfect. After that, to make up for us potentially being a little bit slower when on a budget, I'm actually going to include just a skosh more removal too. I think we're lacking a proper board wipe, and I can't let us go without playing this one. Invasion of Fiora is clutch in this deck. Cast it, give it to someone to defend, and clear the board of whatever is bothering us. Unsurprisingly, we attract a lot of attention with this deck, so killing off a lot of creatures at once is a very big deal. And this isn't to choose one or the other, this can choose both, so if we do need to kill other legendary creatures, we can still play this one at a time where our commander has its indestructible ability, so this is still one-sided for us. And best of all, Tom has enough power to attack and defeat this invasion right away to flip it onto the back half, Marchesa, which not only has a bonkers set of keywords and can draw a bunch of cards, but she also removes counters from permanents. A board wipe that we can manipulate, which could also eventually flip over into a finisher that gives us card advantage and resets our sagas? That's just beautiful. Yes, 100 times yes. And finally, I'd like to up the saga count for the budget version of the deck just a little bit. The first inclusions, probably surprising no one, then Showdown of the Scalds. Excellent card advantage, and the counters can add up if we use them correctly. After that, I really like In the Darkness Bind Them. More tokens, and it has 4 chapters instead of the usual 3. I love resetting this thing. It's just such a nuisance every turn, and making consistent blockers is really good when you're playing a deck that incrementally controls the board and inadvertently draws this much attention to itself. That final chapter can really win a game too, once we're ready for it to go off. I just really like toying with the lore counters on this one to time things just right. And lastly, here's my weirdest inclusion, Long List of the Ents. Okay, listen, hear me out, alright? This card isn't important because that 1/1 counter is going to do us any good. I like it because it's the longest saga, and it's only 1 mana. Tom Bomb needs 4 lore counters to stay protected, right? That can sometimes be tricky to accumulate when we're removing our counters or when we're setting sagas off to their final chapters. Long List of the Ents just sits there, slowly doing its own thing, always keeping enough counters on it to make sure that our commander stays defended for many turns to come, or supplying more counters for things like Goldberry to manipulate too. And I think that's a very valuable resource to tap into. That's all there is to it. Here's the new list with a new price tag. Both deck lists can be found down in the description box below with their respective cuts in the maybe board. Oh, leaving so soon? Tom was just about to start another story. Well, if you must. And in fact, if you have any wisdom that you'd like to share with your fellowship of Saga players, make sure you leave it down in the comments below. And like, subscribe, do that whole thing. You know the deal. The Tom Bombadil. Thanks so much for watching.